Hello friends, this is Mike Williams. The following video contains two of my more popular Beatle presentations. The first presentation asks whether the Beatles' 1960 through 1963 period was organic or engineered. And the second presentation comes to us from Ofer Zeevy, where Ofer compares the song content from the lads' first 7 albums against their live performance set lists. Thanks for watching.
Number 9, number 9, number 9.
Hey everybody, it's Mike. It's Monday, April 18th, 2022. And with this presentation, I'm going to take you through some charts and some video to explore and analyze the Beatles' timeline between the period of 1960 through 1963. It is obviously an important piece of Beatle history. It marks the beginning of the Beatles' story, but does the story hold together? So we're going to review key events along the timeline, especially with regard to elapsed time. And then ask ourselves, did 4 inexperienced young men become the greatest rock band in history organically, or was it all manufactured? And so with that, let's move to the next slide. Okay, so to get started, what I did was to create this timeline, which starts in January of 1960, and goes through December 1963, and then heading into when the Beatles arrived in America on February 7th, 1964. And you can see I populated the timeline with some baseline data. So the first piece of data is we are told John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote 100 songs between 1956 and 1962. They signed their contract with EMI in June of 1962. In 1960, John Lennon was 20 years old, Paul was 18, and George was 17. Starting in January 1961 through 1963, the Beatles' live performance schedule was non-stop. It was practically daily. And I will leave a link down below in the description box so you can check for yourself. The Hamburg performances were especially grueling. Their first Hamburg gig was on August 12, 1960, and that's going to be our stake in the ground. We will take a look at all the other events using Hamburg and that date, August 12, 1960, as the baseline, and then we will move forward from there. As we proceed, keep in mind the persistent live performance schedule is a constant that runs in parallel with the events we will examine. And the live performances is denoted on the chart by this blue bar, which starts in 1961 and runs through the end of 1963. Okay, so here's a clip that I had in some other videos. It goes back years ago, and Pete Best is being interviewed and asked about the Hamburg days and what it was like. And what we're going to hear Pete say is that the Beatles would arrive at the club by 6 p.m., they would play 8 hours a night, they would then go to sleep, wake up at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and then have to be back at the club by 6 p.m. So clearly, Hamburg was not a time when John Lennon and Paul McCartney were heads down writing music. Let's take a listen.
How did you spend your time outside the club when you were basically through working? What'd you do?
Well, by the time we'd finish working, in those days we used to work 8 hours a night. We'd start at 6 and finish at 2 in the morning during the week.
What'd you do before? In other words, your basic time for enjoying yourself was before and maybe a little after, but most of the time before. What did you do before you went into the club?
Well, by the time we'd woken up, it was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Oh, great. In other words, you had, all sorts of time. You had 2 hours to do what?
Yeah, well...
Did you walk around? Did you see the rest of Hamburg?
Yeah, well, the first time we were there, we were like, as well as being musicians, we were tourists.
How did people take you when you walked around? Did you walk around in black leather jackets?
After about a month, we walked around in black leather jackets.
People stare at you all the time?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Okay, so there you go. That's Pete Best explaining what Hamburg was all about. Playing 8 hours a night, going to sleep, waking up at 3 p.m., and then having to be back at the club by 6 p.m. So I don't think there was a whole lot of songwriting taking place. All right, so let's now move to the next slide, and I have 2 more clips. Both of these clips are sourced from the documentary The Complete Beatles, which was a documentary, I think it came out in the 1980s. And both of these clips are in my big presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music? The first one I'm going to play, they are telling us, and again, this is the official narrative, that John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote 100 songs between 1956 and 1962. And remember, they signed their contract with EMI in June of 1962. So let's take a listen.
John and Paul had written at least 100 songs together since they met in 1956, but they hadn't recorded any, original or otherwise. Not until they went to Hamburg again in 1960 did they make their first record, and then only as a backup group for their friend Tony Sheridan. The result? An awkward rock and roll arrangement of My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean.
Okay, so one of the questions I always ask whenever I'm talking about the 1960 through 1963 period is if John and Paul did indeed write 100 songs between 1956 and 1962, where are those songs? Especially as they make their way into the Decca audition, where they recorded 15 songs, and of those 15 songs, 12 were covers, and then there were 3 nondescript originals, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But let's now listen to this clip, also from the Complete Beatles, and this is Alan Williams, who was the Beatles' first manager or handler that brought them to Hamburg. And let's take a listen to what Alan says about getting them booked in Germany.
The first gigs outside the college was at the Jacaranda, which was a tiny little coffee bar where they played in the cellar. I think they got about 5 shillings each.
The Jacaranda was owned by Alan Williams, a small-time entrepreneur operating on Liverpool's bohemian fringe. His latest enterprise was supplying rock and roll groups to a club in Hamburg. When no other act was available, Williams proposed the Beatles.
The group that was playing there was one of the big groups in Liverpool, which was Derry and the Seniors, featuring Howie Casey, the lead. And he sent me a letter over saying, look, Alan, we've got a good thing going over here for all the Liverpool groups. But if you send that bum group, the Beatles, over to Hamburg, you're going to louse it all up. For God's sake, don't send them.
Isn't that interesting? The Beatles were thought of as a bum group, and Alan Williams was told, don't send them over. Okay, so now I have some George Martin clips. The first video is in my big presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music? And the second video is not. This is something that somebody sent me going back a number of months ago, and it's a very interesting clip. But let's play this one first, and let's take a listen to what George says about his impressions of the Beatles upon meeting them.
So Brian then had this tape which he hawked around, and I think it was somebody in the HMV shop on Oxford Street knew George Martin and told Brian to go and play the tape to George Martin, and then he gave us the audition at Abbey Road.
What I said to Brian was, if you want me to judge them on what you're playing me, I'm sorry, I have to turn you down. And he was so disappointed. I felt really sorry for him, actually, because he's an earnest young man.
And you must have liked him then?
I did like him. And I said, but I tell you what, I gave him a lifeline. I said, if you want to bring them down from Liverpool, I'll give them an hour in the studio, okay?
George had done little of no rock and roll when we met him, and we'd never been in the studio, so we did a lot of learning together. He had a very great musical knowledge and background.
I first met the Beatles in 1962. I wasn't terribly impressed with the first stuff they did. I couldn't make out the sound, you know, it was something I hadn't heard before. They had this wonderful charisma. They made you feel good to be with them. And I thought their music was rubbish. Even though they had nothing really behind them, they were still fairly irreverent even in those days, which I loved. You know, I like a little bit of rebel in people, and I like their sense of humour. After all, that was my main stock in trade too. And I guess they quite liked what I've been doing with Peter Sellers and the Goons and that kind of thing. So I looked at these four guys and thought, well, none of them shines as being above all the others. And I had to make up my mind, in my silly mind, who the lead singer was going to be. Suddenly I realized I would take them as they were, as a group. The hell with the lead singer. They would be singing together. So we were struggling with the sound a bit. And I said to the boys, after we'd done a few takes of rather nondescript songs, I said, come into the control room and have a listen and see what we've been doing. And if there's anything you don't like, tell us.
Well, I was looking for something original because I didn't want to do one of the oldies that they've been doing as part of their act. And Love Me Do was the best song that I could find from them at that time. I was very conscious that it wasn't the big hit I was looking for.
Okay, so that's George Martin, and we can see that he wasn't very impressed, and some of the things that he said weren't even close to being flattering by calling their music rubbish. Let's move now to the second video. It's a short clip, and in it we're going to hear George Martin say, "They certainly had no," and then we see him searching for the right words. And then continues, "It wasn't too obvious they could be songwriters at this stage, but their songs were pretty awful." And then I detect an audio edit, and I wasn't sure, maybe it was because he said something that was even more unflattering than what he already said. Just a thought. And then he finishes up by saying Love Me Do was the best they had, which is very similar to what he said in the first clip. So let's take a listen.
I spent a few hours with them in Abbey Road and fell in love with them because they had great charisma. They certainly had it wasn't too obvious that they could be songwriters at this stage because their songs were pretty awful. Even then, Love Me Do was the best thing we had.
They certainly had it wasn't too obvious that they could be songwriters at this stage because their songs were pretty awful. Even then, Love Me Do was the best thing we had.
Okay, so when I listened to this clip, it almost sounded to me like what George Martin was going to say was, they certainly had no songwriting skills, and their songs were pretty awful. And when he started the sentence by saying they certainly had no, he caught himself. And then he couched it by saying it wasn't too obvious they could be songwriters at this stage, but their songs were pretty awful. And then we get the talking point about the boys being charismatic, and Love Me Do was the best song that they had, which, by the way, is a direct contradiction to the official narrative, because if we go back to the Complete Beatles documentary, the clip I just played before, it's telling us that John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote 100 songs between 1956 and 1962, so they should have had this huge portfolio of original compositions coming into their meeting with George Martin. And yet, George Martin is not saying that. He's telling us they didn't have anything. So with that, let's move to the next slide and summarize what we heard from George Martin. Okay, so this is the last chart before I get into the actual timeline analysis. I thought it was important to set the stage with the official narrative along with contradictions within the official narrative. And what I'm going to do with this chart is to summarize what George Martin said by pulling out key phrases. So he told Brian Epstein, "I'm sorry, I need to turn you down." So he was not planning on signing the Beatles. He said that he wasn't terribly impressed. He thought their music was rubbish. He thought they had really nothing behind them, and that none of them shines above all the others. And Love Me Do was the best song he could find from them, and he knew it wasn't the big hit that he was looking for. Okay, so with that background, let's go to the next slide, and we're going to take a look at the timeline. Okay, folks, it's a couple of days later. I had to get some stuff taken care of, but I'm back now, and I'm going to take you through the timeline. And as you can see, it's very populated. There's a lot of information, but no fear, I will step you through it. Now, the first thing I want to call out is that the Beatles went from their first Hamburg gig, which was on August 12, 1960, to the United States in approximately 3.5 years. And as many of you know, the Beatles landed in America on February 7th, 1964. So it is a very aggressive progression through the timeline. And the way I'm going to take you through this is I'm going to go to each event, and you see they are numbered, and we're going to go in that order. Okay? So, number one, as we know, we are told by the official narrative that John Lennon and Paul McCartney allegedly wrote 100 songs between 1956 and 1962. And based upon the clips I played of George Martin to set the stage for the timeline discussion, we can see that this piece of the narrative begins to fall apart. And not only does it dissolve based upon what George Martin has told us, but you're going to see that it begins to fall apart as we make our way through each of the events going from 1960 through the end of 1963. And then moving over to number two, this is just background and a reminder that in 1960, John Lennon was only 20 years old, Paul was 18, George was 17, and so the Beatles were a young, inexperienced, rough-around-the-edges bar and club band. And based upon the clips we just listened to, their musician or playing abilities were average at best. And going back to the George Martin clips, there is no indication or proof of songwriting skills. So just keep that in mind as we make our way through the timeline. Now, number three is a very important thread that runs across the timeline. It starts in January of 1961, right through the end of 1963 and beyond. And it has to do with the Beatles' very aggressive live performance schedule, where they were playing locally, within the UK, and of course, in Hamburg. And the reason why it's important is because the Beatles were playing almost daily, and therefore it's a constant activity that runs through the timeline. So while everything else is going on down here, in the background, we have the live performances taking place. And this kind of schedule, and I'll leave a link down below in the description box, you can take a look for yourself. It is very aggressive, and like I said, they're playing on practically a daily basis, is not conducive to the songwriting process. So let's just say they had songwriting abilities, and we're questioning that, right, based upon what George Martin has told us. Even if they were songwriters, this live performance schedule, this very aggressive schedule, was not conducive to the songwriting process. So what was really going on? Well, Tavistock was not looking to hone their songwriting skills. Tavistock already had their songwriters. They were looking to hone the Beatles' performance skills. So when the time came that Tavistock was going to throw the switch on Beatlemania, the Beatles were ready. They were going to take the show on the road. That is what this is all about. Okay, so with that, let's move to event number 4. Now, event number 4, their first gig in Hamburg, which was on August 12, 1960, is going to be our stake in the ground for all the other events that take place after it. And that's why I have the little start button here. This date is very important. Okay, so Hamburg, August 12, 1960. And remember, at this point, the Beatles are a young, inexperienced, rough-around-the-edges bar and club band. Their music and playing abilities is average at best, and there is no indication or proof of songwriting skills. So keep that in mind as we move to the other events. Now, moving to event number 5, this is the Decca audition, which took place on January 1st, 1962. And I always found it interesting that Decca would open its doors on New Year's Day. When most other businesses are closed for the holiday, Decca availed itself to the Beatles. So we are told that the Beatles recorded 15 songs for the demo, 3 of which were original Lennon and McCartney compositions, and those songs were Like Dreamers Do, Hello Little Girl, and Love of the Loved. And what's interesting, none of these original songs make their way onto any of the Beatles' official album releases. We don't see Like Dreamers Do or Hello Little Girl make it onto vinyl until the release of Anthology 1, and Love of the Loved remains officially unreleased. So what that tells us is the quality of the songs were not at a level where EMI felt comfortable releasing them as album tracks or singles. And of course, we all know the end result of the Decca audition. Decca declines to sign the Beatles. And if we take a moment and go back to box 1, where the official narrative says that John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote 100 songs between 1956 and 1962, and then I mentioned earlier that we would see this narrative begin to fall apart, we can actually see that here with the Decca audition, because of the 15 songs, only 3 were Lennon and McCartney originals, or allegedly Lennon and McCartney originals. And if we take a look at the yellow box at the lower left of the chart, I did some elapsed time calculations, and the amount of time in between their debut gig in Hamburg on August 12, 1960, and their Decca audition on January 1st, 1962, is 1 year, 4 months, and 20 days. So in only 16 months, this young, inexperienced, rough around the edges bar and club band with average playing skills and with no indication or proof of songwriting ability are auditioning at Decca, a major record label. So I would say that this is an indication that there's some stuff going on behind the scenes, and this progression from Hamburg to the Decca audition in 16 months is not organic. So let's move to event number 6, and this is where we have Brian Epstein pitching the Beatles to George Martin. And we know that George Martin declines. He tells Brian, thanks but no thanks. He's not going to sign them. And in the clips I played earlier, we know that George Martin said that he thought that their music was rubbish and that they had nothing behind them. Now, a logical question to ask at this point is, if George Martin turned Brian Epstein down and said, no, I'm not going to sign them, then how did the Beatles wind up back with George Martin and EMI? So Memoirs explains that after George turned Brian down, George received a phone call from a superior who told George, you're going to take them on. So George Martin was overruled. And now we have another example where a big-time producer says, no, I'm not going to take this band on. I listened to the tapes. It's not what I want to work with. And then he gets a phone call. And he's told, wrong answer. You're going to take them on. So again, another indication that we have this orchestration and this engineering taking place, which is pushing the Beatles through the pipeline. Okay, so let's now talk about the EMI contract, and that would be event number 7. So the EMI contract was signed on June 18th, 1962, and if that date seems familiar to you, that's because it's biological Paul's birthday. Coincidence? I'll let you decide. And I have an asterisk there, and I'll explain it in a moment. Now, I already explained that George Martin declined to sign the Beatles initially when Brian Epstein brought the tapes to him, and George was overruled. So now the Beatles have a contract with EMI. But George Martin did not initially work directly with the Beatles. He had assigned that task. He delegated it to Ron Richards, who was an assistant. And Ron Richards later on worked with the Hollies. And so Ron had the Beatles in the studio on June 6th of 1962. And that's why I have the asterisk. So what were the Beatles doing at EMI before the contract was signed? That seems a little odd. Now, some people might argue, well, they knew they were going to sign him, and the signing of the contract was a formality, so they had them in the studio. So that could be a logical explanation, but we'll just leave that there. But the main point is that George Martin wasn't working with him directly. I don't think he wanted to work with them. So he pushed it down the chain, and he had Ron Richards work with them. So in memoirs, we're told that Ron is working with them, he's teaching them songs, and he's recording them. And then after the session, George Martin and Brian Epstein are listening to the playback, and they're not satisfied with what they hear. And it was at this point that George Martin received another phone call. And he was told he had to work with the Beatles directly. In other words, George could not delegate the work to Ron Richards or anybody else on his staff. He was told he himself personally was going to manage and handle the Beatles. So again, we have another indication that this is not a process that is flowing naturally. This is not organic. Phone calls are being made. George Martin is being told you need to sign him. Then George is being told that he has to work with them directly. Okay, so we're starting to get the picture now. And I should also note that Gordon Thompson, who is the author of the book, Please Please Me, 60s British Pop Inside Out, also discusses the June 6th date as well. And if we take a look at the elapsed time between their first gig in Hamburg, again, August 12, 1960, to when the EMI contract was signed, June 18, 1962, it's 1 year, 10 months, and 6 days. So 22 months after their debut in Hamburg, the Beatles now have a signed contract with a major record label, with George Martin as their producer. Okay, so with that, let's move to event number 8. And many of you are familiar with the Mercy Beat article. It came from the August-September 1962 edition. It was presented in my big presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music? And I had it in a couple of other presentations. The article was to announce that Pete Best was out and Ringo Starr was in. But along with making that announcement, the article also tells us that the Beatles will fly to London to make recordings at EMI Studios. They will be recording numbers that have been specifically written for the group, which they have received from their recording manager, George Martin. So this narrative, along with aligning with what we heard George Martin say about his initial impressions of the Beatles, that they had nothing behind them, as an example, it also further collapses the narrative that John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote 100 songs between 1956 and 1962. Because if they were prolific songwriters and writing great songs, then George Martin wouldn't be giving them songs to play. That's just logic. Okay? So that's the Mercy Beat article, and as I've mentioned, it is a smoking gun. Okay, let's move now to the release of Please Please Me, which was released on March 22nd, 1963. And it's important to note that Please Please Me was released only 2 years and 7 months after the Beatles performed their first gig in Hamburg on August 12, 1960. Okay, so to talk about Please Please Me, I'm going to review this chart. And this is a chronology of events leading up to the release of the Beatles' debut album, Please Please Me, on March 22nd, 1963. So as we know, the Beatles performed their first Hamburg gig on August 12, 1960. They are a young, inexperienced band with average at best musician skills with no indication or proof of songwriting ability. And then, a mere 16 months after their debut Hamburg gig, they land an audition with Decca. And we are told they recorded 15 songs in approximately 6 to 7 hours, of which 3 are nondescript originals. Decca declines to take them on board. Then after Decca, we have Brian Epstein pitching the band to George Martin, and George Martin also turns them down, stating that they had nothing behind them and he thought their music was rubbish. And then the next 3 bullets come to us per memoirs. After being declined by both Decca and EMI, Martin's decision is reversed and the Beatles are signed to an EMI contract on June 18, 1962. George Martin assigns Ron Johnson to work with the band to record working sessions. The output of the sessions was deemed unacceptable by both George Martin and Brian Epstein, at which point George Martin is instructed to manage and handle the band directly, meaning no delegating. Then, per the August-September Mercy Beat article, Pete Best is replaced with Ringo Starr, and the article also states the Beatles will be flying to London to record songs specifically written for them, which they received from George Martin. Now, up to this point, aside from the 3 original compositions from the Decca audition, there is still no indication of extraordinary songwriting skills. Then we have Please Please Me being released only 9 months after the signing of the EMI contract. The official narrative tells us the Beatles recorded 10 of 14 songs for Please Please Me in a single day in one long recording session at EMI Studios on February 11, 1963. Please Please Me contains 14 songs, of which 8 are Lennon and McCartney originals. Now, remember that thread on the timeline chart that had to do with the Beatles' live performances? Well, as all of these events are taking place, the Beatles are performing continuously, virtually every day. So the question becomes, when were John and Paul writing music? And what was really going on behind the scenes? And I'm hoping at this point you can see what's going on. Please Please Me hit the top of the UK album charts in May of 1963 and remained there for 30 weeks before being replaced by With the Beatles, which was their second UK album release. So from zero, meaning their debut gig in Hamburg on August 12, 1960, to Hero, the release of their Please Please Me album, in a little over 2.5 years. Now we have to ask ourselves, how realistic is this narrative? And with that, let's talk about the Faustian bargain. Okay, so event number 10 in the red box is the Faustian bargain, which Memoirs tells us took place on October 24th, 1963. It is one of the more controversial aspects of Memoirs. Many people believe this is fictional and it didn't take place, and of course there are others that understand that these types of pacts take place all the time in the music and entertainment industry. But the interesting thing with the Faustian bargain, if it took place, is that it occurred after the release of Please Please Me. And to explain why the Faustian bargain took place after the release of Please Please Me, I'm going to take you to another chart. Okay, so like I said, the Faustian bargain is one of the more controversial pieces of information that comes to us from the Memoirs of Billy Shears. So Memoirs tells us that the Faustian bargain took place on October 24th, 1963, which was 216 days after Please Please Me was released on March 22nd of 1963. And 216, when we do the numerology, reduces to the number 9. The reason the Faustian bargain came after Please Please Me is because the controllers need to show and have the Beatles experience fame and fortune. And as I just covered, Please Please Me spent 30 weeks at the top of the UK charts. So the reason why they did this was to whet the band's appetite for more success. Now the thing is, with these packs, they need to be consensual, which means John and Paul must consent. It has to be of their own free will. But enticing is allowed. Because the premise being, even if you are being enticed, if you have free will, you can decline the offer. And apparently, according to memoirs, John and Paul did not decline. So the controllers would ask, do you like the fame? Do you love the success? The money? There's a lot more if you agree to certain, quote, terms. And according to memoirs, John and Paul agreed to the terms, to give their life for the band's success and immortality. And giving their life for the band's success is referred to in memoirs as death for success. And the immortality piece would be to be known as the greatest songwriting team of all time, and their legacy would live on forever. Now, the question becomes, did John and Paul really understand what it is that they got themselves into? In 1963, John was 23 years old, Paul was 21. And my guess is, if this Faustian bargain took place, is that they did not fully understand. So when they had the ceremony or the ritual or however these things happen, and they were talking about giving your life for the band, I'm not sure that two young guys at 23 and 21 years old took that literally. It's likely that it was taken metaphorically. In other words, giving my life would mean working very hard to make things happen, to achieve that success. So the question of whether they really understood what they entered into, I would say probably not. Okay, so with that, let's move back to the timeline chart and let's talk a little bit about With the Beatles, and then we'll talk a bit about the Beatles landing in America on February 7th, 1964. Okay, so going to box 11, the Beatles release With the Beatles on November 22nd, 1963. That's the same date that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And like Please Please Me, it contains 14 songs, of which 8 are originals. And remember, we're not seeing any indication of this extraordinary songwriting ability from Lennon and McCartney. And as I mentioned earlier, as all of these events are taking place, especially when they're supposed to be writing songs and in the recording studio, we have the Beatles beating the pavement, continuously playing live right through the entire timeline. So the question is, are they writing the music, or is the music being written for them? And if we go down to the yellow box here, we can see that the elapsed time between Please Please Me and the release of With the Beatles is only 8 months. They have rockets on their shoes. Last but not least, before I get to the last chart, the Beatles arrive in America on February 7th, 1964, and February 7th, 1964 is encoded with 9/11. So if we take the month 2 and we add it to the day 7, 2 plus 7 equals 9. And if we take the year 1964, and in numerology 9s equals 0, we have 1 plus 6, which is 7, plus 4 equals 11. So the Beatles arriving in America, which is referred to as the Beatles conquering America, has 9/11 numerology embedded in the date. Okay, so with that, I'm going to move to the last chart where I have some elapsed time calculations where I'm using the date of August 12th, 1960 as the stake in the ground. That's their debut gig in Hamburg. And we're going to see some very interesting patterns with regard to numbers. Okay, folks, so here it is, the last chart, and it's titled Elapsed Time from Hamburg, August 12, 1960. And August 12, 1960, when we do the numerology, is 8 plus 1 plus 2 plus 1 plus 9 plus 6 plus 0 equals 27, which equals 2 plus 7, which of course equals 9. So August 12, 1960 reduces to the number 9. So now I'm going to go through some of the events that we just looked at on the timeline. And then we're going to take a look at the elapsed time. And then we're going to convert the elapsed time to seconds, minutes, and hours. And you're going to see something that is very extraordinary. So the Decca audition took place on January 1st, 1962. And remember, I said it was interesting to me that Decca would open its doors on New Year's Day to bring the Beatles in. And why would that be? Well, that's because January 1st, 1962 reduces to the number 11, which is a master number in the occult. And the elapsed time from August 12th, 1960, that's our baseline, to the Decca audition on January 1st, 1962 was 1 year, 4 months, and 20 days. So that by itself doesn't seem to be too extraordinary. But let's now break the 1 year, 4 months, and 20 days down to seconds, minutes, and hours and take a look at what we have. 43,804,800 seconds reduces to 9. 730,080 minutes reduces to 9. 12,168 hours reduces to 9. Moving down to the next event I have on the chart, which would be the signing of the contract with EMI, and I should call out that the letters EMI also have numerology of 9. That contract was signed on June 18th, 1962, according to the official narrative, and that date is also biological Paul McCartney's birthday. And when we do the numerology on the date, 6 plus 1 plus 8 plus 1 plus 9 plus 6 plus 2, that reduces to 33. And 33 also can reduce down to 6, 3 plus 3, as well as 9, 3 times 3. And moving over to the next column, we have the elapsed time calculation at a high level. Hamburg to the signing of the EMI contract was 1 year, 10 months, and 6 days. But when we look at the seconds, minutes, and hours, they all reduce to the number 9 as well. And then moving down to the next event I have on the chart, which would be when their debut album Please Please Me was released, which was on March 22nd, 1963. The March 22nd date was chosen because it associates with Genesis 3:22, as well as the Skull and Bones number of 322. And 322 is in reference to man being as a god. So go and read Genesis 3:22 and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Now moving over to the elapsed time column, we start with the Hamburg date of August 12, 1960, and we calculate the elapsed time to the release of Please Please Me, which was on March 22nd, 1963. We get 2 years, 7 months, and 10 days. But when we look at the seconds, minutes, and hours, the seconds reduce to 9, the minutes reduce to 9, and the hours reduce to 6. And of course, if we invert the 6, we get another 9. Now let's move down to the Faustian bargain, and Memoirs tells us that this took place on October 24th, 1963. And if we do the numerology on the entire date, we get 1 plus 0 plus 2 plus 4 plus 1 plus 9 plus 6 plus 3 equals 8. What does 8 represent? 8 represents infinity, the force that regulates cycles of life, death, and rebirth. And what were the Beatles all about? Transformation, change, endings, and new beginnings. It also represents balancing the spiritual and the material, and this is fundamental to Luciferianism. It also represents using power, usually money, to get results. And October 24th, without the date, is 1 plus 0 plus 2 plus 4, which equals 7. 7 is another number that is all around the Beatles. And the number 7 represents perfection and enlightenment. And I have a footnote down here to show where 7 comes into play. These are just some examples. The Beatles released 7 albums between 1962 and 1966, containing 77 original songs. So these are the original songs on the albums. I'm not talking about the singles. And 7 years elapsed between the first EMI recording in 1962 and their last recording session, which was Abbey Road in 1969. Now, if we take a look at the elapsed time, starting from Hamburg, August 12, 1960, to when we are told the Faustian bargain took place on October 24, 1963, we get 3 years, 2 months, and 12 days. But again, when we break down the seconds, minutes, and hours, we get 9, 9, and 6 again. And if we flip the 6, we get another 9. And then I took a look at their second album, With the Beatles, which was released on November 22nd, 1963. Again, it's the same day that JFK was assassinated. And November 22nd, the reason why that was chosen is because 11 plus 22 equals 33. And if we do the numerology on the entire date, including the year 1963, that reduces to 7. And so the elapsed time from Hamburg to With the Beatles, when it was released, was 3 years, 3 months, and 10 days. And take a look at the seconds, minutes, and hours. 9, 9, 9. So the question becomes, is this just coincidence? Or is this all planned out? And I mean really planned out. I'll let you decide.
Number 9, number 9, number 9.
Hello friends, this is Mike Williams. Ofer Zeevy is back with us to present his analysis, which looks into the songs the Beatles played live and to assess whether the live performances reflected the songs and hits from their first 7 albums. And if not, why not? And so without further ado, here's Ofer. Well folks, we have Ofer Zeevy is back with us today, and we're going to take a look at something that Ofer and I have discussed in the past in our discussions, but we never actually sat down and did a deeper dive. And so what we're going to take a look at is the Beatle albums, their official UK releases. And the reason why we're going to focus on the UK albums is because they are the official releases. It's not the capital releases, it's the UK albums that are recognized as the official releases. And we're going to do a comparison, or I should say Ofer has done a comparison, where he lays that up against the Beatles set list when they played live between the period of 1962 through 1966. So that's the period we're going to focus on, 62 through 66, because that's when the Beatles played live. So if we take a look at the first slide, this document compares the songs on the Beatles' first 7 UK studio album releases versus the reported set list that the Beatles performed on the day or close to the date when each album was released. And Ofer sourced the set list from the website setlist.fm. It's a very good site and it's a very good source. And so the question as we go through this is going to be 2 questions. One is, does this analysis support the official narrative? which states that the Beatles were geniuses and could do it all. They could write, compose, record, and perform. And when we talk about performing, and I've spoken about this many times, we're talking about extensive live performance gigs. All right, so we have to keep that in mind. It's very constant throughout the timeline up through the 1965 period, but especially 62, 63, 64, the Beatles were nonstop performing live. The other question that we have is, it's the opposite side of the coin. Or does what we're going to take you through support the revised narrative? And when we talk about the revised narrative, of course, it means that the Beatles were manufactured and handled and did not write and play on their early period recordings. And again, we're focused on 1962 through 1966. And so as we go through this, we're going to ask for you to decide. We're not going to decide for you. We'll have our opinions, of course, but you can decide after taking a look at the analysis. Is there anything you wanted to add, Ofer?
Hi, Mike. First, thanks for having me on your show again. It's always a pleasure. And we sourced the website setlist.fm, which lists the songs that the Beatles played on their live performances. Now, many of the shows do not show the songs that were performed, but there are a lot of shows that we do get the set list as reported by a variety of people who either were there or from other places. And the reason we know that this source is, reasonable and truthful is because you can find on YouTube some of the shows, like the Budokan that you discussed, the shows from Shea Stadium and from other places in America, and we see that they match the set lists that appear in order on this website, Setlist.fm. So we can assume that this is a fairly, reasonable and truthful website. And you will see as we take you through the slides, the information that we found there.
Okay. So it's an accurate depiction of what they played on that given day.
Yeah, and I just want to add one more comment. The question that you and I, and I'm sure many of our listeners, people who also have watched your presentations in the last few years, we can ask ourselves if they did write and compose all of those songs. With some practice, there shouldn't have been a problem playing them live on live shows. But as we'll go through the slides, we'll see that this is not the case. There are all kinds of oddities and things that we take a deep dive into, and they really beg a lot of questions, which we'll get to also in the end of this presentation.
Okay, yeah, great. And like we said, Ofer, we're going to let the audience decide. So on the second slide, this is something that I actually put together. And when I did my big presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music?, I focused on their official UK album releases and the songs contained on the albums. And they had 77 original compositions on those 7 albums, Please Please Me through Revolver. So in my big presentation, I did not focus on the singles that they released, and many of the singles were not on the albums, although we had some cases where certain singles were. But there are 2 singles that I did cover in my big presentation because they were recorded during the Rubber Soul sessions, and that was We Can Work It Out and Day Tripper. So the number of songs, original compositions on the official UK releases, again, Please Please Me through Revolver, is 77. So then what I did was I went back and took a look at, okay, so how many singles were released that were not on the albums? And that number is 14. And you can see that the bottom right-hand side of the slide, it is a yellow bar, and there's the 14 all the way to the right. Below that, in the green bar, is the 77 songs from the official UK albums, and that totals to 91 songs, original compositions between 1962 and 1966. I've mentioned the number of 90. I rounded it to 90 in a couple of discussions and presentations that I did, and the point that I had made was that when I took a look at the total number of original songs between 62 and 66, and when I went through the setlist site and I was sampling various performances, I counted up around 25 original compositions that they played over the timeline. So it's 25 out of 91. And so the question I asked, and I still ask, is, well, what happened to the other 65 songs? How come they didn't play any of those other 65 songs, but would continue to play cover songs throughout their performances? In some cases, they might play one cover. In other cases, they played 2 or 3. But my point being is, if they had this portfolio of original compositions, why would they continue to play cover songs, especially as they progressed through the timeline, as they got into 1964, 65, and 66, and so on? They could have went back to this very rich portfolio of songs that they had recorded. My answer to that has always been that's because they were taught songs, and they didn't actually write the songs, and they didn't record the songs. There were studio musicians that were doing the laying down the tracks for the recorded versions of the songs on the albums and the singles. So the Beatles had to learn the songs. So they were able to learn 25 of those songs, and that's why the number is 25 and not something greater. Again, laying it up against this number of 91 original compositions. So again, not to repeat myself, 65 songs just don't present themselves live. And I found that to be very interesting. All right, so with that, that's kind of the two setup slides. And let's take a look at the first slide, Ofer. And from here on in, I'll chime in here or there, but I'm going to give you the floor. And Please Please Me is the first slide that you've put together. So what did you find with Please Please Me?
We begin our journey, which has 7 stops, a stop for each album. And if you take a look at the chart here, the table here, on one side you have the list of songs on the album, on the UK release, and on the other side you have the songs that were performed live according to the information we get from the setlist.fm website, on either the same day, here it's the same day, and I'll explain, or a very close date to the release date of the album. So Please Please Me was issued in the UK on March the 22nd of 1963. And we recall, by the way, that this is like about a short 3 or 4 weeks after the famous February 11th, where they recorded 11 songs in a 9-hour session, which we discussed in the past. And
yeah, I think it was 10 songs, yeah.
10 songs found themselves on Please Please Me, with 4 additional songs that were released on 2 singles previously. So what you see on one side is the list of songs on the album Please Please Me. We did mark songs which are covers, and you can see that on Please Please Me we have 6 covers. So out of 14 songs, 6 are covers. And then on the other side of the table, on the same day, on March 22nd, the Beatles appeared on the Gaumont Theatre in Doncaster of England, and they only performed 6 songs. Love Me Do, Misery, A Taste of Honey, which is a cover, Do You Want to Know a Secret, Please Please Me, and I Saw Her Standing There. Now, what we can learn here is, and by the way, I checked also other dates on the same month, on March of 1963, and the set lists are the same. So we see the same 6 songs. This is what they performed. It could be that on some shows they were appearing with other people, with other performers. So they just, appeared for a very brief time, like 20 minutes. But this is what we have. And so we had 1 cover, which was A Taste of Honey, and 5 other original compositions. Now, we learned that from memoirs and other investigations, which basically your work, is that 4 early songs were written by Bill Shepherd in the Pepper Potts group. I Saw Her Standing There, I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, and Please Please Me. So 2 of them appear here on this very, very short set list. So what we see is that they did 1 cover. We know they did a lot of covers in the previous, before they were signed, when they appeared in Germany and in Liverpool, and 5 songs which are originals. Okay? Now, we have to remember that in the setlist.fm also calculated how many shows they did each year. And I want to mention this because this is important. In 1960, they did 134, 1961, 246, 1962 was like a record year. They did 391 shows. But also in 1963, they did 339 shows throughout the entire year. This is an amazing number of shows. It's almost every day. Now we know that on some days they did double shows, okay? But if you think that 339 performances out of 365 days, that's 1963, this is, I would say, cruel schedule of shows. I don't have any other word to describe it. Just day after day after day of performing and moving from theater to theater, from city to city. It's very, very hectic. It's very difficult, but this is what we know. So here, the beginning point, we see that the album, 6 covers out of 14 songs, so six covers and 8 originals. And on the show, on the set list, they have just performed 6 songs, 5 originals, and 1 cover. So we still cannot make up, anything of importance. But let's go on to album number 2, and we'll see how it progresses.
Okay, there's one thing I wanted to comment on, Ofer, because you mentioned it. I just want to make sure we clarify what you meant by it. So you said, as per memoirs and external investigations, 4 of the early songs were written by Bill Shepherd. I Saw Her Standing There, I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, Please Please Me. Now, what we mean by that is there is a passage in memoirs, and it's written in a way that it's coy. I will admit that. But it strongly alludes to Bill Shepherd, or Billy Shears, being involved in writing some of these early songs. And one of the points, Ofer, that I have surmised, and I think you have too, is that at the very least, the songs were written by him, and 2, they were recorded, possibly as demos for the Beatles to learn from. And one comment that you made to me going back, it was probably about a year ago, you said to me that you could not find a concrete date as to when the Pepper Potts album was recorded and released. Do you remember telling me that?
Yes, I found a comment by someone on a review board that he says that he saw a copy of Bill Pepper and the Pepper Pots album from 1961, but we don't have any evidence of that, unfortunately, maybe. Now, the albums that appear now and they show on Wikipedia and everything, they say that the albums were released in 1964. So we can only guess whether it was in order to hide the fact that these songs were actually written way before the Beatles recorded them, and in fact put on an album, if this album really appeared in England at least in 1961, maybe 1962. But the only source we have so far is Memoirs, which states that it talks about, I think, on I Want to Hold Your Hand.
Yeah. So if Memoirs is correct, and as I mentioned, it does lead us down that path, then it says that Billy was involved in the Beatles and the whole project, the initiative, the PSYOP, whatever you want to call it, early on. It was way before 1966 is the point. Okay, so we'll let the audience decide which way they want to go with this. And somebody could say, well, it was released in 1964 and so on. But, we're talking about deep state activities, folks. And this is a point I make all the time. They put out information and data that they want to put out. It's as simple as that. They can make any record they want to make. And when I say a record, I mean documentation, giving us dates as to when things were released or published and so on. I mean, they create that information. So they can lead you to believe whatever it is that they want you to believe. Okay, so all I'm saying is, and Ofer is saying, is to keep an open mind that it's possible, it's very possible, that the Pepper Pots and the recording of these songs were done prior to the Beatles coming on board with EMI, and that George Martin had tapped Billy to write these songs, to record them, to be used as demos so the Beatles can learn them. Okay, so it is a premise. Okay, so the next slide is with the Beatles, which is their second UK release, and we see here on the right-hand side, I don't want to steal your thunder, but there's a lot of covers that wind up being played live. But let's just start with where you want to start with this slide.
So the second album, the comparison again is on the same date. And by the way, it's a very famous date in the American history, of course, November 22nd of 1963, the Kennedy assassination. But this is not the point of our discussion today. On this date, in the UK, we saw the release of With the Beatles, the second album. Again, 14 songs on the record, and 6 of them are covers. So although 1963 was the breakout year of the Beatles in the UK, and this album came towards the end of 1963, we still see that in terms of material, on the album, 14 songs, 8 new or 8 originals, and 6 covers. So we still have a lot of covers. And if you look at the other side of the table, you see the set list. Now we see 10 songs, 5 originals and 5 covers. Now, I made some comments here. From Me to You and She Loves You were released as singles in 1963, but they do not appear on any one of the first 2 albums. Now, in 1963, I Want to Hold Your Hand was a huge UK number 1, 5 weeks at number 1, also released as a single, but we don't see it on the set list. The song was recorded on October 17th, a month before the release of With the Beatles and before the show. And in fact, it was released on October 29th, but they still did not play it live then. I found this to be a little strange. This huge hit does not show on setlist previous to November 22nd, 1963, or afterwards. So this is interesting because we know that when a band issues a single in order to promote it, and if they wrote it and composed it, and with some practice, there shouldn't be a problem performing it. And yet on the set list, we see 5 originals, 5 covers, and no I Want to Hold Your Hand. Okay, and this runs also on the dates, performance dates after November 22nd. So this I found to be very strange.
The other thing I found very interesting with the set list is when we take a look at the cover. So that's where we have the finger pointing to the songs. Of all the songs from With the Beatles, the current album, the only original is All My Loving, which is the third song showing on the set list on the right-hand side of the table. All of the other songs from With the Beatles are cover tunes. So that begs the question, why did they not play more of the original music from With the Beatles? What it says to me is the reason why that happened is because they had not learned the original songs from With the Beatles. Now, With the Beatles was one of those situations where, if I remember my numbers or my days correctly, they recorded all of the songs, I think it was 2 sessions within a 7-day period of time. So it was non-contiguous, which means they came in, they recorded the album, we're told they recorded the album, then there was a break, they came in for a second session, and they finished recording the rest of the album or the songs on the album. Okay, so again, we have one of these situations where we have a very, very compressed timeline. This is a problem that we see throughout the Beatle timeline. Very, very compressed periods of time as to when they're in the studio and supposedly recording these songs. But along with not playing I Want to Hold Your Hand, which you're absolutely correct, that should have been on the set list, you would think. They played only one original from With the Beatles, and everything else that was on the With the Beatles album that they played on the set list were cover tunes. Very odd.
And also I found it interesting that Please Please Me was not performed. Please Please Me was actually the second single after Love Me Do got to number 17 by the end of 1962, but Please Please Me got to number 2 on the official UK chart. And it was really the breakout hit in England in 1963. So 5 covers on the set list, and no I Want to Hold Your Hand, the new single, and no Please Please Me, which was also a huge hit in the UK. So that's the story of the end of 1963.
Okay, so we're seeing, again, folks, we've been through 2 albums, and with the release of With the Beatles, we're seeing a lot of cover music being played and songs that should have been played because of their popularity not showing up on the set list. So, again, we'll let you decide. Should we go to A Hard Day's Night, Ofer?
Yeah. So album number 3, that's a soundtrack to A Hard Day's Night. It was released on July the 10th of 1964 in the UK. What we see is, again, 7 songs on side A, 6 songs on side B, and they're all original. And then if you switch to the other side of the chart, we see I chose the show which was on July 17th, so that's like a week after the album was in the stores. They appeared on the Paris Theatre in London on that evening, and they only played 8 songs. Now, I must say that this setlist is very sketchy, looks very sketchy to me. I checked that with other dates on this, the month of July of 1964, and we also get partial set lists, but this is most probably what they performed on stage. 5 out of the 8 songs are from A Hard Day's Night, which is accepted. The other 3 songs, or 4, if you count the Kansas medley, you see song number 7 is Kansas City and Hey, Hey, Hey. That's a cover. So 5 originals and 3 covers. Now, Can't Buy Me Love, the huge number 1 in the UK in 1964, and from this album, does not appear on the set list. So instead of playing the number 1 hit, which also features on the new album, they played again several covers. Again, very strange. Also, the big 1963 hits do not appear on this 1964 set list. So again, major hits from just a year before do not feature on the live sets. Covers, yes, but not the big hits from that broke them to the UK public. So again, this is a kind of strange situation. I just had one more comment. In 1964, they also performed a lot. According to setlist.fm, they had 232 shows in 1964 alone. So that's also a lot. Mike, do you want to add anything?
No, you mentioned 3 covers with the live show, but there were 2, right? We had Long Tall Sally and Kansas City.
Yeah, I counted. If you count Hey, Hey, Hey as part of the Kansas City.
Gotcha. The medley. So this is interesting too, because you mentioned Can't Buy Me Love is not on the set list.
Yeah.
And there were other songs that, like you said, hits from Please Please Me as an example, that didn't make the set list yet. They're doing Long Tall Sally and Kansas City. And somebody might argue, well, you know, they're good rockers and, you know, so it picks up the crowd. They're fun songs to play and all that stuff. But in my mind, that conflicts with the story that we're told about the Beatles, where they're genius songwriters and they wrote all these brilliant songs. And so why would you not play those brilliant songs? Why would you continue to bring covers in? So they've got, we're told, 13 original songs from A Hard Day's Night, and they've got 2 covers in the set list. They couldn't pick 2 more songs from A Hard Day's Night, originals, or some of the hits that Ofer has mentioned instead of the covers, or 2 more original songs from their first album, Please Please Me. You know, so again, I agree with you, Ofer. This is very sketchy, and the fact that it's only 8 songs, just 8 songs doesn't seem right either. It seems like it should be more songs. Most of their sets as they went through time were had to do with the number 11. Did you want to go to the next album, Beatles for Sale?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go there.
So we jump to December 4th of 1964. This was the Christmas album, Beatles for Sale, album number 4. And we see, again, 14 songs. And we still see covers. I mean, this is the 4th album by the Beatles. And they already have many hits, but still some of the songs, I count here, I think 5 on the album, are covers. And again, this is very interesting. Now, if we switch to the other side, we see that I picked the December 24th, 1964. That's the day before Christmas Eve, I think. They appeared on the Hammersmith Odeon in London, which is a famous theater in London. And if we check their set list, we see 11 songs. And again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 covers. So 11 songs on the set list, and 5 of them are covers. And we're talking about the Beatles by the end of 1964, after 2 years, 4 albums, and many hits already in the charts and in the fans' hearts. And half of this show is covers. This is very strange.
Yep.
So my comments here is also, I want to add, I Feel Fine was released also as the 1964 Christmas single and became a huge number 1. It is not on the album, but we see that it is featured on the set list. Okay, that's I Feel Fine. 5 of the 11 songs on the set list were covers. Why is that? And only 3 set list songs here were number 1s. So Can't Buy Me Love, A Hard Day's Night, and I Feel Fine. They did not play the other 3 number 1s so far. I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, and For Me to You. Also not featured this Please Please Me. So we see again 5 covers out of 11 songs instead of hits, big hits for the Beatles. So again, this is a very, peculiar set list.
Yeah, and we see on Beatles for Sale, this is when I'll Follow the Sun appears on an album. And the official narrative tells us that that song allegedly goes back to, I believe it was 1960. And we're told that that's when Paul McCartney wrote that song. And then 4 years later, it ends up on Beatles for Sale. Now, I've questioned that whole narrative. I don't believe I'll Follow the Sun was written in 1960. There's a lot of content that's put out there that is put out there to mislead and to support the official narrative. But here we have I'll Follow the Sun, and what's interesting to me is the reason why I'm talking about this is if the song was written back in 1960, that means it's a well-played, well-rehearsed song. It's now on the album, and it does not appear on the set list. So I would think that I'll Follow the Sun, which is a very good song in my opinion, should have been on the set list, given its history.
I want to add another thing. We see two songs on the set list which will return in later set lists, and we'll get to them. If you see song number 3, Babies in Black, and song number 8, I'm looking at the set list, She's a Woman. Now, these are by no means important songs out of the 250 songs that the Beatles recorded. And I'm not saying they're not good songs. I'm not saying, people like them, but they're not important. I mean, it's not Eleanor Rigby or Yesterday or, they're not there. And we still see that these two songs out of a very short set list appear and reappear. You'll see them in the next slides also. So it could be that these two songs were songs that the Beatles were, felt comfortable playing, or maybe there's another reason, but to me, although we're talking about two original compositions, these are songs that I wouldn't choose for a set list.
Yeah, especially Babies in Black, which my personal opinion is it's not one of their stronger songs.
Yeah.
In fact, Beatles for Sale is considered probably one of their weakest albums that was released during the 62 through 66 period. So, yeah, that's a very good point, Ofer. Why do those songs come back? Yeah. Should we go to Help?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So we jump to 1965, to August. Just one comment before we go over the chart here. In 1965, we see a reduction in the number of shows. They did only 85 shows. So that's a major reduction. Of course, they did the movie Help, and they had other activities, but it seems that, the craziness of appearing like day after day after day has, disappeared. That's what we see. So album number 5, Help, was released in the UK on August 13th of 1965. We see that it has 14 songs, and again, 2 covers on the album, on side B, Act Naturally and Dizzy Miss Lizzy. So this is album number 5, and we still see 2 covers on a Beatles album, which to me seemed like fillers in a way, but that's just my opinion. If we jump to the live show, so a day after release in the UK, they were in New York at Shea Stadium. That's August 15th. 2 days after that. And this is what they played. We get a 12-song set list, 8 originals and 4 covers. And you can see the covers marked. Also interesting, they played 12 songs live instead of the usual 11. And they played the last 5 UK number 1s, including the current single and number 1 song, Help. But this setlist, again, it's like a mishmash of covers, songs which are not like the top hits or the important songs by the Beatles, but 5 hits.
Well, just that Yesterday is not on the set list. That's amazing.
Yeah, you're right.
And now, folks, we are 5 albums in, and the set list contains 4 covers. In my opinion, there should be no covers. Because, again, we have to put it into the context of the Beatles' official narrative. Brilliant, prolific, genius songwriters. That set list of 12 songs, in my opinion, should be 12 original compositions sourced from the 5 albums that they have released. Yet, like Ofer says, 12-song set list, 4 covers. And they didn't play Yesterday. So, I don't know. Again, it seems very off to me. Should we move to Rubber Soul?
Yeah.
Okay, let's move to Rubber Soul now. Let's take a look at what's going on there. Okay.
Album number 6, the release date in the UK was December 3rd of 1965, so obviously ready for the Christmas shoppers. And also on the set list, which is, they appeared on December 3rd of 1965. They did 2 shows on that day. They appeared in the Odeon Theatre in Glasgow of Scotland. And they did 11 songs with only one cover, which is Act Naturally. Now, Date Ripper, and we can work it out, were issued as a double A-side single and were not on the album, but the Beatles did perform them, as we can see on the set list. Also, we see that they still perform songs which were not among the greatest hits. And again, we see Baby's in Black and She is a Woman. So in an 11-song set, these 2 songs take the place of much bigger songs or hits. So this is again rather odd to me.
Yeah, and now we do see Yesterday being played live, but this is some time down the line now when I would say that Paul McCartney learned the song. So it took a period of time for him to learn the song to be able to play live. If it wasn't studio players behind the scene or playing to a backing track, which I've discussed this before, that was taking place. But we'll give them the benefit of the doubt here and say that we were playing this stuff live, okay, just for the sake of argument. But you're right, Ofer. I mean, considering now that we have 6 albums under their belt, that set list of 11 songs is not, I mean, it's not stellar.
I agree.
Like why Baby's in Black is still being played is beyond me. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about?
No, I think we can move to the 7th album of this time period, 1962 to 1966.
Revolver.
Yeah, Revolver. Just one comment. In 1966, we see that the shows count was reduced to only 35. And of course, August the 29th was the last show. So in 8 months, they only appeared 35 times. So we see a major reduction in live shows in those first 8 months of 1966. Let's take a look at the chart here. Album 7, Revolver. We have 14 brand new songs. Okay, so the album was released on August 5th of 1966. So the album and the single, double A-side single, which is Eleanor Rigby and Yellow Submarine, are in the stores, are in the music shops. Okay? So August 5th, the album Revolver is in the album section of every music store in America. And if you go to you were to enter a music store and go to the single section, you would find Eleanor Rigby and Yellow Submarine as a double A-side single. Now we jump only a week later to the first show from the final tour ever, and they're in America, of course. The first show was in the International Amphitheater, that's in Chicago, on August 12th. And take a look at the set list. 11 songs, 2 covers, 9 originals, and the single Eleanor Rigby, Yellow Submarine, was not performed live, thus strangely receiving no promotion from the band. We see the return of I Wanna Be Your Man of all songs being performed. They did perform the big summer #1 single Paperback Writer, which is not on Revolver. By the way, the promotional clip for Paperback Writer is the last time we see Biopol alive. That is on a Beatles film clip. So this is, I know we talked about it in the past, a week after a new double A-side single and a major album is released. We don't see Eleanor Rigby or Yellow Submarine or Taxman, as you have mentioned, on the set list. But we get 2 covers. We get She is a Woman and Baby's in Black again. We get I Wanna Be Your Man, which was a hit for the Rolling Stones, but the Beatles perform it here. So again, a very strange set list on a major tour.
Yeah, this is very telling. Ofer, you and I have discussed this before. There's not one song from Revolver that made it into the set list after Revolver was released. And of course, Revolver is considered by many Beatles fans and rock music critics to be one of the greatest albums, rock albums of all time. And not one song from Revolver made it onto the set list. Now, some people will want to argue, well, the songs got more sophisticated and it was difficult to replicate them in a live setting and all that stuff. As far as I'm concerned, that's just excuses and rationalization, because there are ways to present the songs live. You could do acoustic versions of them. You can do edited versions of them to bring that to the audience. I think not doing them is very strange. So you would figure some way out to get those songs played in a live setting. And it just didn't happen. And again, 2 covers, rock and roll music. Aren't we tired of that by now? Long Tall Sally, the same thing. Baby's in Black. I Want to Be Your Man. I don't know. It doesn't resonate with me, Ofer.
Yeah, one would assume that, let's say Lennon and McCartney did write all of the songs. So relatively close to the recording and then the issuing of the album. So with some practice, they could have done it. They could have performed it.
Absolutely.
They are the Beatles. I mean, the biggest band in the world. And we see this set list. And by the way, there are videos you can catch on YouTube from this American tour. And these are the songs, and in this order. I did catch a couple of, at least a couple of them. This is Revolver, which concludes this very interesting time period in the Beatles' history.
Yeah. And so some folks who might be new to the research might be asking, well, why didn't they play something from Revolver? Well, it goes back to the analysis I did with Rubber Soul in my big presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music?, which stated that the Beatles weren't writing the music. The music was written for them. And they weren't on the recorded tracks on the albums and the singles. That was all done by studio musicians. I call it the Wrecking Crew model. And the songs that the Beatles did play live, they were taught those songs. They had to learn those songs and rehearse them, and then they would take them out on the road. So clearly what happened in the case of Revolver is they didn't have time to learn those songs and practice them and rehearse them to take them out on the road. And that's why there were no songs from Revolver on the tour that followed the release of the album, because the Beatles didn't know how to play those songs. They weren't taught those songs, and they didn't learn and rehearse them. Okay, so if you're just new to the work here, that's my position. Ofer, I don't want to speak on your behalf, but what's your take?
Yeah, this is again, you have to remember this is the most popular band in the world, and Lennon and McCartney are hailed as the greatest, and many Beatles fans consider them to be geniuses. So then we see the set lists with many covers, and I think that they were very proficient in doing covers, because this is what they did before they got their recording session.
Yeah.
The recording contract, sorry. They were very proficient, and also they played, we know that they played 6, 7, 8 hours a night, and I think in 1960, 1961, but mostly covers. That's what we know. So maybe they felt more comfortable doing covers, but again, after 7 albums with major songs, major hits, we get these set lists which raise a lot of questions.
Yeah, and you touch on a very important point here. So all of the live gigs and performances that they were doing between 1960 and 1963, that was done in order to increase the Beatles' performance skills. They were performers. So that was part of their programming, if you will, their conditioning, to take the psychological operation known as Beatlemania and take it out on the road in support of this narrative, which says that, as Ofer mentioned, we have these prolific genius songwriters, and here are their songs. So that's what the Beatles were doing. They were being worked in order to be more proficient in learning songs and then performing them and taking them out live. That's why they had this non-stop, extensive gigging that started back in 1960 when they went to Hamburg back in August of 1960, right through the end of 1963. And if you don't believe us, what I'll do is I'll put the link down below. In Wikipedia, they have a whole list of all of their live gigs going back to 1960, and they were playing virtually every day. And as Ofer mentioned, when they were in Hamburg, their stints were 7 to 8 hours a night. So they got to the Hamburg club at 6 p.m., and this is per Pete Best, by the way, and I'll put that interview down in the description box as well. And they didn't leave the venue, the club, until 2 a.m. And then in that interview that Pete did, he said that by the time they woke up, after 7 or 8 hours of playing, it was 3 p.m. in the afternoon. And then they had to be back at the club at 6 p.m. So that left a 3-hour window of time in which they did, I guess they ate, right? Had to wake up, and then get themselves over to the club by 6 p.m., So there was no songwriting taking place in Hamburg. Absolutely not. Anybody who continues to try to believe that they were writing songs, in their sleep, on the back of napkins, all of this stuff, it's just nonsense. It's a nonsense narrative. Ofer, should we move to your summary, conclusions, and thoughts?
Yeah, just to summarize, we ask ourselves, when did they have time to write songs? So we know that the Beatles were touring heavily between 1960 and 1966. They had performed 1,461 times. Again, this number is according to the setlist.fm website. Mainly in the UK and Germany. When any of the first 7 albums were issued in the UK, they were either in the middle of touring or beginning to tour. That raises the question again of when did they have time to write all of those songs. That's one thing. Also, there are very short breaks between recording an album and beginning or continuing to tour. This is very unusual, but I guess these were the Beatles' lives throughout this time period. This is very unusual because in many cases, bands record an album, then start rehearsing for a tour, and only then tour. This is not the case with the Beatles, since their hectic live dates are too many. It seems they did not have time to rehearse, prepare for touring, and no time to write songs. Now, these are, I guess, Mike's and my conclusions, but I'm sure that people who are watching this can write their comments and let us know if they agree with us or no. And again, this presentation is not built on memoirs. This is simply a comparison between albums and performances. And I know that there are many musicians, Mike, who follow your work. But even if, a listener is not a musician, only a music fan, I think that this does raises several questions, which, this is what we're trying to conclude with.
Yeah, so as I've mentioned many times, Ofer, what I do many times, and I know what you do, is we take existing information, existing data that's contained within the official narrative, and then we take it apart. We do a deeper dive, we analyze it. Does it make sense? So, as Ofer mentioned, all of this information that's been presented, it's out there. It's not hidden. It's information that's there. As an example, they performed 1,461 times. That's an incredible amount of live performances. When I did the Rubber Soul analysis from my big presentation, did the Beatles write all their own music? Going back to what Ofer said, they were on their American tour. They did 16 cities in 16 days, I think it was, Ofer?
Yeah.
Something like that. Right? So they were doing a city a day. So they would perform, they'd get on an airplane or a bus or whatever, they get to the next city. This was in the U.S., right? I think they did one stop in Canada, if I recall. And then they had a 6-week break. and then they went into the Rubber Soul sessions on October 11th, 1965. And the official narrative tells us that when they came into those sessions, they had no backlog of music. They wrote, rehearsed, arranged, recorded, mixed 16 songs, 14 for the album and 2 songs for the single. We can work it out in Day Tripper in 30 days. And my contention is that was not possible. So, again, like I said, if you take the official story and you stop taking it at face value and you start to examine it, what happens is it's like pulling the thread on a sleeve on a sweater. It eventually just comes apart. And this is what I have found, Ofer, I know you as well, when we take a closer look at this thing. You know, things start to not make sense and the story begins to collapse, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take a look at the last slide here and take us through this, Ofer.
Yeah, so I did a summary chart just to show the percentage of covers out of total songs on an album and then on a show. And if this runs too fast, you can, of course, you can stop the video and just take a look at the chart. There's too many numbers here. But basically, the idea is like this. I mean, why did we get so many covers on albums on live shows? So this is a summary of covers the Beatles recorded on albums and performed on their live shows. The table basically summarizes the 7 albums and shows we have covered in the beginning of throughout this presentation. So if you take a look at the chart, you get the numbering on 1 through 7 on the left side. We start with the total song of an album. This is the second column. Covers in that album, for example, album number 1, there were 6 covers out of 14 songs. That amounts to 43% of non-original compositions. And then if you follow it, there's the number of songs performed on the live show. As we've seen on the show close to the release of the first album, they only performed 6 songs, one of which was a cover. Now, I don't want to go through all the numbers, but let's jump to the bottom of this table and show like the bottom line numbers. So we have 97 songs on the entire first 7 albums. Look at the very last row. 20 of them were covers, which is 21%. And on the live shows, they had 69 songs, 20 of which were covers, which amounts to 29%, which is almost a third. So a third of all of the Beatles songs performed live were covers. Okay, so this is a very telling number, in my opinion.
Maybe some other band, it might not be a bad number.
Yeah.
But for a band that had, at that time, by the time we got to 1966, had 91 original compositions, when we add in the 77 original compositions from the albums, and then 14 singles, original compositions that were not on the albums, that's 77 plus 14 is 91, and almost 30% of the songs that they played live were covers. That doesn't make any sense to me at all, like I said, especially when we put it into the context of who the Beatles were and are, at least what we're told.
Yeah, so I'm continuing to read the second bullet here, which is, you know, just like what you said, 29%, so almost a third of the performed songs by the Beatles were covers. And what the reliance on doing so many covers live begs several questions. So if Lennon and McCartney wrote so many original songs, where are they? And you mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that 65 out of 90 or 91 songs were never played live.
Right.
That's a lot. And then we can ask ourselves, why did they not test them live? Or why not test more songs live instead of doing covers, which we know many bands do?
Right.
Why did they choose on some occasions to play covers instead of performing some of those songs which were the biggest hits at that moment or at that year? And
or even in previous years. I mean, going back, right? Why didn't they play some of the big hits from the beginning? I mean, fans would want to hear that.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Now, since the early days, they did mostly covers. Did it take off some pressure off of them when performing live? I mean, did they find it easier to play covers, which they knew probably from the Hamburg and Liverpool early days? Did they feel more confident doing covers, at least for a portion of every concert, instead of doing new music? That's also something we have to think about. Or, and this is something, Mike, you touched upon on several of your more recent presentations, was there a logistical issue or consideration as well? If they were helped by backstage musicians, was that the reason why they did so many covers live? We don't know. We can only think and discuss what we see.
Yeah, so I think what happened, Ofer, again, my opinion is that it took time for them to learn the, quote, original songs. So George Martin had them sitting in a studio, and they had to be shown these songs, how to play them, what was the melody line. So when you think about it, they had to be taught the guitar chords, they had to be taught the different riffs, the lead guitar, the bass. Ringo had to learn the drumming. So the point I'm making is that this is not something that they just did in a couple of hours. So the process of learning these songs took time. And then once they were taught the songs and they studied their parts, then they had to rehearse them. All of that takes time. And so they were only able to learn a certain amount of songs within a certain period of time. And that's why they had to fall back on covers, because they already knew those. There was no learning involved with Long Tall Sally and Kansas City and songs like that. But the learning of the, quote, original compositions was a process. It's not just something you whip off and you bang through and, yep, got it. That didn't happen. That did not happen. So that's why I believe we see all the covers, because it just took a long time for them to learn the original stuff. And I use the term original loosely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is an excellent piece of work, Ofer, as usual.
Thanks.
And again, we gave our opinion. Everybody knows where I stand on this stuff. So, but Ofer and I are in sync because we've had discussions on this stuff. But we're going to leave it to you. You decide. We're presenting information. We're presenting data. We're presenting our research and our analysis. That's what we're doing. And if it resonates with you, great. If it doesn't resonate with you, that's okay too. Like I've always said, people think I'm always trying to convince people. I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. People will come to their own conclusions based upon what it is they want to believe. And whether they change their position on something, that's completely up to them. You cannot convince somebody of something before they are willing to listen and to open their minds to a different perspective. So that's why I don't waste my time doing that. So, Ofer, any closing?
Yeah, I just want to state maybe like a half a sentence from the any of the last two versions of memoirs, where we learned that George Martin basically got the Beatles into the studio to use their voices. And that's a line I vividly remember from memoirs. And And that's like a huge clue for us. Well, there are other clues, of course, and other statements in memoirs, but when we compare the quality or the quantity and the quality of songs on their albums, the first 7 albums, there are many great songs, but we can conclude, I guess, again, this is my conclusion, and I know yours too, that they did not write or compose or even play on many of the songs in that time period, and most probably in the second period after 1966. And but again, this is something it will be very interesting to see in the comments to this presentation. And again, Mike, I wanted to thank you for inviting me, and we'll continue to follow this story and see what happens.
Yeah, anytime, Ofer. You know that you have an open invite. Your work is excellent. I do want to say it's not just memoirs that tells us that George Martin liked their voices. We hear that from George Martin himself in interview clips. I really liked their voices. And they had charisma. How many times have we heard that? They had charisma. And he liked their voices. So, again, a lot of this work, folks, before we conclude here, is outside of memoirs. So memoirs was essentially foundational. It was a stepping stone that got me curious, it got Ofer curious, and other researchers and colleagues of ours, and we've gone outside of memoirs, because that's what memoirs does. Memoirs is actually asking you to step outside the book and to research beyond the book, because it would be impossible to contain everything in one book. It wouldn't be 666 pages. It would be 66,666 pages if it had to cover everything. So that's the thing. It gets, if you're intrepid enough, it gets your interest piqued, and you start poking around and taking a look at things. Before you know it, you have presentations like this. So, well, Ofer, again, I really appreciate you coming on, and anytime you have any analysis or research you want to present, just let me know, and we'll get it out there. I really appreciate the time and effort you put into this presentation.
Thank you so much.
Okay. All righty, and with that, folks, we'll wrap up. The comment section is open. Let us know what you think, and we will talk soon. Have a great day.